Well, George, it's an absolute pleasure to have you as the guest on our podcast. And before we get into sort of the details, right, and no doubt everyone wants to hear you talk about zero trust. The first thing I want to ask you is, how does a law graduate go from graduating in law to doing a law internship to becoming a network engineer to then becoming the chief security officer at SMU? That's quite a few direction changes.
So I actually, my undergrad was in liberal arts, which meant I studied a lot of philosophy and math and different things, languages. I learned to speak ancient Greek. So, really, really awesome experience. And I thought when I got out of college that I was going to go be a stockbroker. I actually interviewed on Wall Street and realized yeah, I totally wouldn't want to do that. So I got a job at GTE. So started out, working on their DSL lines, their department. Became a network engineer from there. And actually, I went to a couple of different startups. One in Denver and then another in Dallas. And I realized I love startups. I love open source. And that was actually the genesis of why I went to law school. Was, hey, there's this thing, the GPL. I really want to get into that. There's a lot of open source licensing out there. While I was in law school, the GPL version 3 came out. I actually did a directed research around that. And again, I thought I was going to go be like a lawyer. Never expected to be at SMU for 20 years. But I got that tap on the shoulder from our CIO and said, hey, we really need a chief security officer, right? The writing's on the wall. All of the security folks at the time reported into kind of our infrastructure networking department. And I had that background as a sysadmin at one of my startups, doing, Linux support or whatever, in addition to being a network engineer. So I had this crazy background of law, network security and, sysadmin. So it made a lot of sense to kind of bundle all that up, and we brought the team under me, and gosh, it's just been fun. I mean, being in higher ed, it's like the Wild Wild West. So it really rewarding, and that's what's really enabled me to write some of these books. Is just being in this environment that's really thoughtful about the way we do things, and I've been there so long. I've had the chance to grow the whole program and be a part of every facet. Whereas if I was at a larger organization, I'd be much more specialized. So gosh, it's been such an awesome, incredible journey.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I think the loss of Wall Street and the loss of the bar has been the gain of the InfoSec community. Otherwise, if you hadn't made those choices and didn't hate Wall Street, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. So you talk about sort of your role as CSO at SMU, right? And about how interesting it is and how varied it is, right? I just think sort of the role of a chief security officer at a education institute, right, must be so kind of varied and demanding for a number of reasons. Because I was reading some of the blog posts you'd written, and you spoke about how sort of when you sort of came to talking about sort of enhancing security. I think one of the research fellows fairly high up in the organization said, oh, no way, right, research should be open and free, and you're against sort of academic freedom. How do you balance all of these things in your role?
So it's interesting. I didn't realize this when I started, of course, but higher ed is really highly regulated. So if for example, you were at a bank or at a retail shop, right, you'd have some good guardrails on what you do. Whereas in higher ed, we do all of it. We have student loans, right? That makes us, compliance-wise, under, the same obligations that a bank would have. At the same time, we've got a health center and we've got HIPAA. We do credit card processing. We've got student records. We've got European folks. We do, so dealing with privacy laws and everything. The variety is really challenging. and that's actually what appeals to me. And I think, generally speaking, in the security world, right? We have to stay on the bleeding edge, right? Mm-hmm. We're always having to secure that next new thing. Like, okay, containers are coming out. How do we do that? How do we do security in this whole new ball game? Mm-hmm. And frankly, I get bored really easily. I think if I were doing the same job for 30, 40, 50 years, right? No knock on the folks out there that are still doing COBOL programming, mm-hmm. But man, I would have gotten way burnt out from doing the same thing that long, right? I need to keep up with the latest thing, and security is that career that gives that to me.
Completely right. I'm sort of constantly fascinated by just new, interesting things that cybersecurity, in all its manifestations, throws up. And actually, you describe such that we often don't think of educational organizations, academic institutions, as actually being this. It's almost this like conglomerate of lots of different industries bundled together, right? How do you bring all of these various departments that all have different priorities and different challenges? How do you go about establishing a unified security culture?
It's really hard, right? And some people say it's top down, others say it's bottom up, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's both. And the really unique thing about SMU and I didn't have anything to do with this. It was way before my time. But the thing that most people know about Southern Methodist University is that we got the NCAA death penalty. We're the only university. So back in like '88. Right, uh-huh. Remember there was the big football scandal, mm-hmm. Where we were paying players before it was like cool to pay players. Right, we're everybody was doing it. Right, we're the ones that got caught. Mm-hmm. Fascinating, to be a part of the university. 15 years later, that culture was extremely risk adverse. Mm-hmm. And that's not something that George did as the CISO, right? I inherited that, but thinking, oh my gosh, like every decision we make, every new vendor, the way we handle financial decisions, all of it, I think, is influenced by that one incident. Mm-hmm. And lots of organizations have had. Breaches or small incidents, right? There's that famous saying out there: "Never let a good crisis go to waste."
Yeah, I've heard that.
So again, I think those things are the things that stand out in people's memories, and that that collectively drives culture. Mm-hmm. And so I've wanted to find ways to be proactive instead of reactive. And so, those are great opportunities. You can also create those opportunities, and you can also, build relationships with your leadership team. Again, that's something that takes time. But I remember when I rolled out my simulated phishing program, mm-hmm. This is like 8 years ago now, in the first campaign I sent, I caught our president. And, I didn't get yelled at, I didn't get punished. But it's fascinating because I know other CISOs that have launched simulated phishing campaigns mm-hmm. that did catch their CEO or whatever, and they don't do simulated phishing campaigns anymore, right? So you've got to have that trust that mm-hmm. Everybody's going to work together towards the common goal. And again, when you can align that to the mission of the organization, right? Yeah. We need to protect our community. We're here to protect our students who are vulnerable, who are mm-hmm. Growing and learning. That's magic. Tapping into that to help drive culture is again something that it's so amazing that we can be a part of that in the security world.
And I think I just on that last point, right? Something that that is sort of regularly expressed is that in order to do your job as a security professional well, the first thing is that you need to understand the organization that you're protecting, right? And essentially their value prop and then your own value prop that ties in with theirs. So can you express how you express your value prop to your board?
Yeah, so I don't know if you've ever seen the Charlton Heston movie Soylent Green back in the 1970s, kind of a sci-fi thing.
I'd love to hear about it.
I don't want to, I'm going to spoil the ending, but essentially, like the world has grown so much, they've run out of food. And so like there's this special food, it's called Soylent Green, that like people love, and it saved the world because we can feed everyone now. And it turns out the famous saying Charlton Heston like runs out when he figures out what's happening. He's like, Soylent Green is people, right? You're feeding people back to the people. But oh my gosh, in security, right? Security is people. It's not the technology.
Yeah.
And so again, when I have conversations with our board or with our leadership team, I tell stories about humans. What's the human impact to our organization, right? When I started out doing this, I had a security monthly security report. It was all like metrics focused and like, okay, we gotta how many firewall blocks have we seen or whatever. It wasn't human. Right, I just numbers. It's huge numbers, but okay, cool. What does that mean? When you can tie it back to, okay, we had this, a person who was faced with identity theft. Here's the impact to them, and so I turned it into more, article-driven, more story-driven things. And again, that changed the audience. Right, I went from just being really concerned about. Well, I don't want people to share the metrics. This is really just something, for our executives to, I'm going to send this newsletter to everyone at the organization, right, including students. I'm going to, make it publicly accessible to the interwebs or share it on LinkedIn or whatever. And that response, right, again, like, oh my gosh, that's very different than the traditional way of people do security, where it's a black box, right? I'm going to play my cards close to the vest. I'm not going to talk about things. And that's what I saw with, in writing some of the books that I've written. When I talk to people, people want to help. And then they're like, well, it has to be off the record because I can't tell these stories. Our PR department doesn't want me to, or I've got an NDA or whatever. And man, if we're not sharing our stories, then the next generation of security people are going to have to learn all of this over from scratch.
Absolutely.
And we can't do that. We have to stay ahead of the bad guys out there. And so again, telling stories. As an author, right? They always say, "Show, don't tell." And I think there's a lot of telling. When we give security advice instead of showing. That's the difference.
Absolutely. And I think sort of almost to apply that whole security through obscurity is no security at all, right? It's the same with stories. If you don't sort of understand the issues that you're trying to combat, how can you possibly understand how you're going to secure them or the value of the security that is being built? So kind of everyone here is here to sort of learn about zero trust and learn about zero trust from you, right? So let's start with an easy one. Give me your favorite zero trust analogy.
Oh man, gosh, I think. Well, I'll give you the worst analogy.
Okay, go on.
And we'll go from there. No, so what zero trust isn't. Right, I mean, obviously the two words imply like the X-Files, right? That's like the Fox Mulder, trust no one, and that's not what zero trust is. So zero trust, the analogy, don't use the analogy X-Files, right? You actually have to work with other human beings to make zero trust happen. So although zero trust implies don't trust. Don't take the cynical approach of okay, I can't trust anyone. What we're doing there is we're substituting cynicism for good judgment. Right? Zero trust takes analysis. It takes thoughtful exercise of the practice of security to help protect our communities. Probably my favorite analogy is just a jawbreaker, right? So what instead of an M&M, right, which is the crunchy outside with the soft, chewy inside, jawbreaker is hard all the way through.
Yeah.
So in terms of a candy, if you want to do zero trust, make your organization a jawbreaker, and hopefully the bad guys will break their teeth on the jawbreaker when they try to bite into it.
Takes me back to sort of late days of primary school, where you go into sort of these penny stores and fill up your sweet bag with a bunch of jawbreakers and cola bottles, etc. And then wish that you'd been careful with those jawbreakers as your teeth ache from chewing into them. So okay, so the whole I absolutely love the way you kind of described what zero trust is, and more importantly, what it's not. Right, and definitely the bit about zero trust doesn't mean no trust, right? And it's often something that we hear when sort of at conferences, etc. Almost people saying that I don't want to hear about zero trust anymore, right? And I don't like the term. So, what is a better way to express zero trust?
So the way that I think about zero trust, there's a phenomenal book by Stephen Covey. Who's actually the son of the Stephen Covey who wrote 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Okay. His son, Stephen Covey, also wrote a book called Speed of Trust. Really fascinating book. And people have their definitions of what trust is, right? So, gosh, I know what zero is, but what does trust mean? And in his book, he argues that you have to have both trust and analysis at the same time to have good judgment, right? So think of a matrix, right? On the x-axis is trust. It's not a binary thing. Like a spectrum. I either trust or don't. You actually have a y-axis, and the y-axis is analysis or skepticism or whatever you want to call it. But you have to have both at the same time, right? If you have low trust and low skepticism, well, that's kind of gullibility. If you have low trust and high skepticism, you're going to have indecision, right? You're not going to be able to get anything done. Yeah. Covey talks about like a trust tax on an organization, where if you don't trust any of the human beings around you, you're not going to get anything done, or it's going to take a really long time. Same thing with partners out in your different organizations or outside of your organization. So having both is really critical. And I think that understanding fundamentally of trust is something we don't necessarily talk about a lot in organizations. And frankly, when you get into zero trust, right, the real trick is, how do I spot the trusts, right? Yeah. When I look at a computer, router, firewall, server config, like, what's the trust? How do I go through and get rid of them? That's what zero trust is about. It's not about not trusting people. It's about finding those trusts in our digital systems and getting rid of them. We've been doing this for years, right? Whether that's deperimeterization, it's a tactic that falls under zero trust. Maybe server hardening, right? Just as simple as that, like removing all the bloatware that comes from whatever OS vendor you have. You only need the things that you need to run. That's really what zero trust is all about. It's bringing all of those separate tactics, because that's what we were doing. We were implementing tactics all across the board to remove trusts. Zero trust is the overarching strategy that helps bring us all onto the same page and gets us marching in the same direction.
So, without getting too philosophical, what is the meaning of trust in the context of cyber?
I think, what is a trust? There's a lot of different folks that talk about trust out there, and I think in terms of a digital system, it's about ease of connection, right? And that's why we put trusts in, right? I'm going to put in a firewall rule to allow me to talk to any server in my data center. Don't do this, by the way. This is bad advice. This is what we're not to do. But right, that's a trust.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Now, when my computer or my device gets compromised, that's what the bad guys exploit to go and have free reign into an organization. That's what a bad guys exploit in terms of multi-factor authentication. Right, I trusted that device for however long you're allowed to set up a trust for. That's a challenge, and we've got to find the right balance, right? Between I don't like to say that I don't think there's a trade-off between usability and security. I think that's kind of a myth. But that's the way that a lot of folks think about. Well, my end users, my clients, are going to revolt if I don't. And actually, I think you touched on this in the beginning, right? When the highest ranking academic person at my university said, "Don't put a firewall between me and the internet." Well, okay, what they were saying, in the background was, I don't want to slow down my organization. I want to, be able to perform my research without restriction, whatever my research is, and we need to enable that. And I think zero trust actually helps us, right? So at some point, our clients, our customers, at SMU, it's our students. I think they began starting to ask, like, well, why aren't you doing X, right? And I think, gosh, if you're signing up for a bank today and they don't set you up with multi-factor authentication, hang on now, I'm not going to do business with that bank. So at some point in our history, right, it became table stakes to have security. And I think for every industry, for every technology, that's the path, right? We start out, we're just figuring out how this stuff works. We're innovating, and we didn't necessarily think about security. To like, oh man, we're going to go out of business if we're not doing security. And I think that the secret sauce of being a CISO today is moving that maturity model over to where you're building in security from day one.
So I actually had this sort of question come up later, but you've kind of you've sort of taken the conversation there, so I'm going to ask it right now, right? So you've talked about things like, and I think to quote you, it's like you don't believe that usability, productivity, and security are sort of contradictory to each other, right? You kind of very much believe that those go hand in hand. But and then you also, and this is to quote something from your book, you said the DevOps folks are all like Ricky Bobby, right? Right? They just want to go fast, right? So what I would ask you is that how do you, as a CSO, right? How do you provide the security framework, right, to allow the Ricky Bobbies to go fast, but do so safely?
I think, again, it comes back to understanding humans, right? I love the joke of Ricky Bobby. I actually, I use that with permission from John Kindervag, who created the Zero Trust. So thank you, John, for that. So when I wrote the book, I had the huge benefit of having John Kindervag, kind of riding shotgun, being able to bounce ideas off of. But I also I'm not an expert in every domain of security, right? So I'm not an identity expert necessarily. I'm not a cloud or DevOps expert. So randomly, I tried to find as many experts as I could. And when I sat down with some of the folks who are really great at DevOps, the developers, it's not that they don't want to do security. It's that they're incentivized to all of their bosses need to get code out the door. Again, that's great. It's really needed for lots of organizations, and actually that's a benefit, right? So Zoom is a great example. Zoom is a DevOps company. So when I'm not going to call him a cyber criminal, a hacker, former NSA person disclosed to 0 days, right? What did they do? They're like, cool, I'm stopping everything else, and we're going to dedicate all of our DevOps cycles to fixing this. That's incredible, right? That's one story of how DevOps enables security. And I think that particular hacker, again, we in the security community have some norms, and I think we like to disclose to a company first and give them some time. I don't think that process was followed in that case. So really, it's hugely unprecedented for an organization to be able to turn around a fix in 24 hours with no prior notice, right? It's an incredible story, but it just shows you how much security and DevOps, right, can be aligned. And I think again, we have to be able to come to our partners and work with them and meet them where they are, right? So a lot of what we can do with Zero Trust in the DevOps world, but in particular, is to just be a part of their pipeline, right? Can we? They're already doing testing as a part of the pipeline, so let's just add a few tests. Can we check for secrets before the code gets pushed? Right. So thinking about it, instead of trying to secure the code at the end of the pipeline, Zero Trust is really about problem management. Let's eliminate whole categories of issues before they become a problem. Let's think about prevention. Let's get everybody on the same page, and actually that enables CTOs and DevOps folks to not have to go and do those fixes at the end of the cycle, right? It's just built into the process.
Awesome. So I'm going to quote your book again, right? This is obviously me just proving to you that I've read the book. But we'll come on to that again in a second. So I think kind of at the start of the introduction chapter, you say the most effective means we have available to protect ourselves in cybersecurity is prevention. And the most effective strategy for prevention is Zero Trust, right? And I'm going to sort of challenge you slightly, so bear with me, is that if we think about sort of the era of perimeter security, so think of, let's say, 90s, 2000s, was very much sort of the era of prevention, right? The bad actors are on the outside, everyone on the inside is trusted, right? So as long as we shut the front door or we keep that tightly locked, we're all good, right? And then we have then we realize that actually that was failing, right? They were still getting in, and then it was a focus around sort of detection and response, right? Okay, let's put all our effort, or majority of our effort, in being able to detect, being able to respond, being able to recover, right? And that kind of became sort of the driving force, I would say, sort of 2010s, right? And I'm going to say to you that the current era is around containment, right? Assuming that the bad actor is going to get in, we may not be able to detect them, so the focus is around minimizing the impact of that, right? What are your thoughts on that? Say it's not Zero Trust is really about containment more than prevention. What are your thoughts?
So, technically the definition we use for Zero Trust is John Kindervag's definition, and we go with that in the book. But the definition is, Zero Trust is a strategy for preventing or containing breaches. So, we want to remove the trust in digital systems, and ideally, we'll prevent them, and prevention is possible, right? Yep. So, and I think a lot of folks have maybe given up on that, right? And one of the tenets of Zero Trust is to assume breach. We also will attempt containment. So I think it's about both. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure is really true in security, right? They've done studies about this, to show, again, getting at the beginning of your code pipeline much less expensive than having to fix things after the fact, right? So I argue that Zero Trust is actually the only thing in security today that actually meets the definition of a strategy, right? So I had an argument with another CISO about whether defense in depth meets the definition of a strategy. I argue that it does not. But when you think about it, right, a strategy has to have two things, right? You have to have a goal that you're trying to reach, and you have to have a plan for how to get there. And ideally, with a good strategy, you can measure how far along you are towards achieving that. So when you think about something, again, I think of defense in depth as a tactic, but when you think about defense in depth, well, okay, cool. What's the goal?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think if you look at the technical definition of defense in depth, it's actually, the goal is to have multiple layers in order to prevent a failure of one of the layers. So ultimately, if there's a goal for defense in depth, it's about dealing with failure, not preventing or containing breaches. You're with defense in depth, you're not actually addressing why a particular layer failed. And a lot of folks will call defense in depth expense in depth because, well, what do we do? We just add more layers. Well, that's great. Not efficient. Right? And so when you're pitching your board on something that sounds like, we're just going to add a bunch of layers, well, how do you know when you're done, George? Well, how much money do you need? Honestly, if JP Morgan can spend $1 billion a year and get breached, if my university pursued that same approach, well, how do we know it's going to be effective? It's not an effective strategy. I think it's more like a tactic. Zero Trust is that strategy to help get all of the teams engaged in the right ways. We can leverage the right tactics at the right time, so that we're not having tool bloat, that we don't need 50 or 100 tools to accomplish what we can do with 3 or 4.
And that, of course, I agree with that. But there was a few really interesting things that you said. You spoke about sort of the cost associated with when you're just sort of pursuing a defense in depth approach without really having a strategy around it, right? So today, particularly with the macro conditions, right, there is this whole sort of, if ever there was a real pointed focus on ROI, we have that at the moment, right? So how does following a zero trust strategy really deliver not just security benefits, but ROI, cost, operational efficiencies, simplicity in architectures? How does a zero trust strategy deliver these things?
Yeah, so in the book, we used John Kindervag's design methodology for zero trust. So there's a 5-step process. And really the foundation of that 5-step process is this concept of a protect surface. A protect surface is like the opposite of an attack surface. And I understand that Gartner has a whole buzzword like attack surface management, or and hype cycle or magic quadrant. Attack surface management is a lie, and it's a marketing term that's gives you the idea that if you could like shrink your attack surface, then you'll be more secure. You can't shrink your attack surface. Your attack surface is any device in the world. So when you look at the Peloton or Parlay breaches, right? What did they do? Both organizations had an API. One to go to mobile phones, one to go to treadmills or exercise bikes or whatever. Well, guess what? The bad guys just reverse engineered that API. There was a blind spot to those organizations. They didn't, see or have controls around it to be able to detect anything through the API. And the bad guys exfiltrated all the data helpfully through the API that the company provided. That's attack surface management. Well, if you've got a mobile app, any mobile phone in the world is your attack surface. So instead, contrast, Zero Trust uses this concept of a protect surface, right? What am I trying to protect, right? That requires that I have to understand how the business works, that I have to have an inventory, right? I have to know what my top, apps are, where my critical data is. So I'm going to get my arms around that which I'm trying to protect inside a protect surface. and I'm going to have a repeatable process that I follow to protect that, right? So when I think about deploying tools as a CISO, right? In the olden times, I'd think, okay, I got to deploy firewalls everywhere. I've got to deploy EDR everywhere. Actually, when I think about just a protect surface, I'm going to provide bespoke controls to just that protect surface. So instead of licensing, for my whole organization, all of these different tools, I'm going to only use the ones that are needed inside that given protect surface, right? So if I have a protect surface that has an API, for example, I'm going to go to one of those awesome companies that have API security baked in. I'm going to put that in there. If it's web facing, I'm going to have a web application firewall. If it's a device, obviously I need endpoint EDR. I'm going to have a firewall, but I'm going to bake that and have a custom tailored suit, if you will, to protect that individual protect surface the way that it needs to. And okay, if that gets, again, I've got multiple protect surface. This is the concept of microsegmentation, another tactic that falls under zero trust. I'm going to put like assets together, and so I'm going to contain that incident to just that one protect surface, right? And understand how those other protect surfaces interact, and hopefully I've contained that to a single protect surface. That's really the power of this zero trust design methodology, is really having bespoke controls, and then again iterating, monitoring, logging everything. Again, another one of the tenets of the design methodology, but having that feedback loop. Again, it's about, okay, now that I've got my protect surface, how do I spot the trusts? How do I remove them? Sometimes that's through proactive architecture. I can think ahead. Sometimes that's through pen tests or tabletop exercises or other things that help me find my own blind spots. And hopefully I'm being proactive and doing that before the bad guys find them for me.
Yep. And I've had the pleasure of sort of having a few conversations with John, and that sort of the concept of the protect surface, like obviously that's like he constantly sort of stresses that again and then again and again, and it sort of absolutely makes sense, because I think some of the challenges with zero trust adoption, when organizations say that, all right, it's really difficult for us to follow a zero trust strategy because how am I going to apply it to absolutely everything, right? And you say, actually, no, you've almost got to flip it on its head and say, what do I most need to protect, and focus on that. So why are we still having this challenge? Because again, to me, it comes as a zero trust strategy. That to me is common sense, right? Thinking about the protect surface, that is common sense, right? As to where to start. And then as you iterate, you constantly look at that. What is the next thing you move to, right? But why still the barrier to adoption?
Yeah, so it's fascinating. I've talked to a lot of CISOs both before and after the book came out, and honestly, the common denominator of folks who have launched their zero trust initiatives and failed is because people, right? It's not the technology. It's not that they didn't have all of the tools they needed or whatever. It was about politics. It was about people didn't know what to do. They didn't know where to start. And so again, I'm harping on people here, but oh my gosh, if zero trust is just for us security nerds, right, we're going to fail, because it's not the security nerds that are having to go out and do all of the things. You've got infrastructure teams, you've got DevOps teams, you've got help desk or desktop support folks. So everyone in IT needs to be able to understand zero trust. And if I, as a CISO, can't understand zero trust because all of the marketing hype or whatever out there, and there's so many competing things, if I can't understand it, how do I expect a new network engineer to my organization to be able to go and deliver on zero trust? Right? Oh my gosh! Obviously, the right answer here is now go buy George's book, Project Zero Trust, available on Amazon and Audible, and have them right to break down the barriers. Or we can just make it really simple. But again, everybody has to understand zero trust in order for our projects around zero trust to be successful, right?
Yeah, and I agree, and I think what I what I love about the book, and there's lots to love in it. And I feel that the inspiration from it came from some topical event that happened. I don't know, and some fictional organization. But what I liked is that sort of the validation of the progress, the tabletop exercise, right? That they run. And those of you who haven't read the book yet or listened to it, you'll get the reference when you do. Sort of how does that, like, because validation is so important, right? I think that as security practitioners, we don't do enough real validation, right? So why is this particularly important to show sort of ROI in your sort of zero trust program, but also ensure, like, get validation that you're making progress?
Yeah. So, and again, this is another one of the reasons why zero trust projects fail. When I've talked to other CISOs, right, the average time it takes for a zero trust transformation is like 3 to 5 years, depending on where you're starting from. Right, it can vary by a couple of years. But oh my gosh, think about executive turnover. Right? Think about CISO turnover. Think about the budget cycle. So if you're not showing progress, from year to year. Well, how do you keep justifying that? How do you, continue to get support? I mean, as a CISO, you ought to be out there developing relationships, building trust. But part of that, is breaking Project Zero Trust down into bite-sized chunks. And so in the book, we, suggested that their journey lasts 6 months. And that was driven by like a new project release. And so they had to get it done by a certain date. I think that really aligned well with the business, right? All the business leaders realized, we got this new project or product coming out. We had some security incidents. We want people to be a part and feel comfortable that we're going to deliver good security, good products. If we don't, we think the new product isn't going to compete in the market. And again, that's aligning with the business. That's connecting the dots. It's not saying, we know we have this new product coming out in 6 months. We'll be done with zero trust in 5 years. Again, there is a zero trust maturity model out there, folks. So there's one in the book that is blessed by Kindervag himself. There's also one now from CISA. And so I'm a part of the Cloud Security Alliance working group on Zero Trust, and Kindervag and Chase Cunningham and others are collaborating with CISA to get that document right. But wow, I mean, I think collectively we're working together, right? Oh my gosh, the security community is working together to have one consistent definition of zero trust, and something to start with, instead of I got to go look at Forrester and Gartner and get behind the paywall, and I hear all these startups like throwing zero trust products at me. Okay, let's go to a consistent definition that we can all get behind, right? And talk about okay, I have a tool that can help you in your zero trust journey. Yep. Not, I have the tool that is all of your zero trust needs all in one, right? Yeah. That's what we're really about. And again, we've got to make it simple and bring everybody to the table.
Yeah, I think I absolutely like the whole sort of thing about being able to almost look at it in sort of 6 months blocks at a time, right? And align to a maturity model, and being able to say that in 6 months we want to be here, in 12 months we want to be here, is just such a more digestible way of being able to adopt and also course correct, right? Because right. Otherwise it's kind of it's like, fund this 5-year program, but don't come and ask us anywhere between now and 5 years time what we've been up to.
Again, in 2 years, the company might be using entirely different technology.
Yeah.
So, how do you keep up with that in terms of your zero trust? Well, gosh, you've got to make it a step-by-step approach, right? So the motto for the fictional company in the book, so the company name is MarchFit, and their company motto is every step matters.
Yep.
And every step matters because you have to take one step to enable the step after that. They don't have to be big steps, right? You don't have to be you don't have to be running. You can walk. Baby steps count. And yeah, I think that approach to zero trust, right? We're always improving step by step. Everybody can come walk with us and make it inclusive. That's really what's going to move the needle.
Yeah, 100%. So just kind of looking forward, right? Let's looking into 2023. As a CSO, what are you most worried about?
People. I think honestly, there's a lot of burnout that's happened with the pandemic. I think recruiting obviously is the big challenge. I think the Great Resignation is a huge concern. That battle is being waged in our leadership teams across different organizations, right? How do we continue to enable security? How do we continue to lift up the organizations in each of our own unique digital transformations? I think we've got to keep investing in people to keep making progress. And if we stop doing that, again, security is always at the bleeding edge. So if we're not, dedicated to continuous learning, to lifelong learning, we're eventually going to start to fall behind. And I think when you're overloaded and you're getting burnt out, that's the first thing to go. Is I'm gonna stop reading. I'm gonna stop listening to books on tape or whatever. However it is you get your education. Man, that is going to set us back years. We've got to be welcoming new people to security. I keep hearing people are turned off by security because it's the spooky kind of Fox Mulder types, and I want to do something that helps people, and security does help people, but if we're turning people away from security because we're again, we're not investing in folks, we're putting out job descriptions that are supposed to be entry level, but they're requiring 20 years of experience in zero trust, and admittedly, think about some of the job descriptions that say 20 years experience with zero trust. Well, guess what? Kindervag invented zero trust 12 years ago.
Yeah, excellent. Exactly.
If he can't, anyway, I'll get down from my soapbox a little bit.
You are preaching to the converted here. So I completely agree. I think I almost feel that it's not far off us seeing sort of academic institutions offering undergraduate degrees in zero trust, right? So George, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you today. Just really enjoyed the conversation and could have gone on forever. Please, everyone, do go and check out George's latest book, Project Zero Trust, a story about a strategy for aligning security in the business, on Amazon, or like me, if you prefer it through your ears rather than through your eyes, go and check it out on Audible. George will be very pleased to know that I'm fairly sure that I hold the world record for how quickly that book is finished. So yeah, I sort of found the time between yesterday and today to just whiz through it. Didn't miss a word, except for the appendix. I have to admit, I didn't listen to the appendix. It's fantastic. I feel that today in our conversation, I have been the Dylan, or the Luke Skywalker in the story, and you have very much been the Obi-Wan. So I appreciate the time, George. Thank you so much for spending this time with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Appreciate it.